All right. Well, welcome back to Beyond Foundations. My name is Dean VanEvery. I'm the associate pastor here at Grand Avenue Baptist Church here in Ames, Iowa. So this is the fourth episode of my four-part series on the doctrine of divine simplicity. Believe it or not, this was supposed to be one short episode, this whole series. So things have expanded. Anyways, if you want to listen to the whole thing, I'd recommend. So if you're just starting, I'd recommend going back to the first episode of this little series, and start there. The difficulty of simplicity is where I started. If you're not sure whether or not you actually want to take the time to listen to these things, I'd encourage you to start with the second episode. I think that's like 25 minutes or so. It's called Simplicity Simply, and that's kind of basically the short version of what I'm talking about and kind of why it matters. So the first episode really is not entirely about simplicity itself, more of kind of a prequel to the doctrine of simplicity. The first one is kind of a prologue, really just tackling the idea of, hey, this doctrine is hard. Here's why hard doctrine is important to wrestle with. So that's kind of its own thing. So you can either skip that or just listen to that. That's fine. Do what you please, I suppose. But if you're interested, go ahead and start there. That's kind of the calisthenics, the warm up to the rest of what we're trying to do here. But yeah, if you're not sure whether or not you want to invest just a bunch of time into listening to me talk about the doctrine of simplicity, start with the second one. That you might listen to that and end up in this place of kind of like, all right, well, I heard what we had to say. That was interesting, but I don't really feel like I need to dig a ton deeper, and that's fine. That's great. I'm totally fine with that. Or you might listen to that and go, hey, this is actually interesting. I want to know more. Again, fine with that. That'd be great too. So this little mini series basically is meant to serve as kind of a like a deep dive kind of warm up for the seminar that I'm putting on this weekend on the nature and attributes of God. So really, divine simplicity is a kind of a helpful anchor point for basically a robust, well-rounded discussion on the nature and attributes of God, kind of taken as a whole. So really spending several hours on simplicity is meant to somewhat economize my time with the other attributes, right? If you get simplicity and kind of all the rivers that feed into the doctrine of simplicity, if you get simplicity, then things like immutability, impassibility, even things like aseity, I'll define that on Saturday. We'll get there. And God's character attributes like love, justice, mercy, even those if you get simplicity, those can be covered, can be addressed in really a lot less time, right? You get the basics with simplicity. The rest just kind of unfolds from that. So if you've listened to these 4 lessons coming into the seminar, you're probably going to be able to get more out of the seminar than you would otherwise. But again, I am doing the seminar, assuming or trying to make it accessible, even if you haven't heard any of these episodes. So it's not like you need these to do that. So if you don't have time or you're listening to this afterwards, it's meant to be a take it on its own kind of a thing. But this will just help, kind of give you a leg up a little bit. So through these 4 episodes, and more of it's going to come out today. I've used simplicity really as a springboard to touch on lots of related topics, especially just on the nature of God more broadly, as well as the nature of theology, the study of God. So if this is helpful, sign up for the seminar. It's free. We're gonna have some great snacks. So there'll be lots of worst case scenario, we'll have a good time and have some food. Uh, but yeah, so come out this Saturday morning. We'll dig into God's attributes and God's attributes a little bit more broadly. So we'll tackle a bunch of different topics there. I'm looking forward to that. I think it's gonna be something that's helpful. I think it will encourage you. I think it will be a worshipful experience for you. So the sign up link, I should be able to find that in the description here. Hopefully see you there. Okay. Quick pause, real quick. So just a heads up, I actually already recorded this whole episode, and it's just way too long for a single episode. So I'm actually going to end up subdividing this further into smaller episodes of its own, and I'm just not gonna re-record it. Quite frankly, I just don't have that kind of time. So what I'm gonna do is basically break it up into a few kind of natural breakpoints where I move from one topic to another. And I'm gonna kind of add some seams, kind of like this, right? A little bit of orientation at the start of each new episode. Hey, here's what we did last time. Here's what we're going to do this time. And then some kind of concluding thoughts to try to help, at the end of it, at the end of these things, to try to preview the next one. But really, I'm going to keep the main body as just what I've already recorded. So if it feels like an episode just kind of starts with a full head of steam, that's why. And also, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not going to go back and comb through, but if I say something that kind of doesn't really make sense, as in, like, hey, in the last episode, those kinds of pointers might not map quite right, because I recorded it all as if it were one episode. So just try to use some context clues to know if I'm talking about, episode 3, right, the episode before this big chunk, or kind of one of these episodes, after I've subdivided them down. Not ideal. I get that, but here we are. So I'm just trying to make this somewhat digestible. I actually think this is going to end up being better, even with some of those weird quirks. I think it's going to be a little bit better with a little bit more kind of road mapping. Within kind of tied up within this kind of, you listen to a little bit at a time, get a refresher, listen to the next little bit, get a refresher, listen to the next little bit, get a refresher, right? So I think in the end, I'm happier with it as kind of a bunch of littler things along the way, but just not ideal. So I'll explain here in a little bit kind of my goal for this episode, right? But that's really my goal for the next several, the next handful. So in this one, I'm really only going to tackle the first part, even kind of the first part of the first part. I'll get into a little bit of intro, kind of why this matters, and then do a little bit of kind of historical work. So that's what you have ahead of you here, but that's kind of just the beginning. So, anyways, let's get back to it. I'll send you back to historical Dean. So let's whatever. Let's get back to it. Anyways, my hope here for this lesson, and I got into this a little bit on the last one, is basically this, right? The study of God isn't just kind of some academic exercise in hair-splitting distinctions, right? The study of God, trying to understand Him and know Him, is nothing less than the pursuit of life to the full. So often, we kind of get in trouble when we start to use God as a means to some other end, right? We pursue God so that He will give us peace of conscience, right? And that's great. We seek God in hopes that He will give us a happy marriage, right? That's a good thing. Or a successful career. Again, that's a good thing. Or we just, kind of try to be religious to look good in front of other people. Less of a good thing there. But in a dramatic way, kind of one of the helpful insights from divine simplicity is that there just is nothing beyond God. So seeking God, if you're doing it right, if you get it, if you see it, just is the end in itself. All good things, everything else that you're pursuing, is wrapped up in God. It is meant to point you to God as the source of these good things, right? There is nothing higher. There is nothing deeper. There is nothing richer. There is nothing more ultimate than God. One of my favorite metaphysical, ontological verses in the Bible is Psalm 36, verse 9, right? So let me read verses 7 through 9, kind of leading up to this for you. So 7 and 8 says, "How precious is your steadfast love, O God! The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights." Okay, so that's 7 and 8. Right. So here we see God is the great refuge of your soul. Kind of talked about that a little bit recently when we looked at the book of Ruth. God is our refuge, who we take shelter in. Right. So the security, the satisfaction, the delight that you are looking for is wrapped up in God. Right. So seek God, study God. He is the source of all these good things you're longing for. All right, so 7 and 8, and then we'll get to 9 here. "How precious is your steadfast love, O God! The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights." Now we get to verse 9. "For with you is the fountain of life, and in your light do we see light. Okay, God is the root and base, the fundamental source of life, right? There is no life behind or under him, right? He's not getting fed by some, more ontologically basic source behind him. He's the base, the foundation, the source, the fountain of life itself. All you're looking for in created things, happiness, satisfaction, peace, joy, all of it, you were created to find. But all of it comes from God himself. And it's his light that makes us see light, right? All light, all knowledge of the world bounces off of our blind eyes until his light actually opens our eyes to see the world rightly, right? Only once we start to see the cosmos, the world, and our own life in light of his light will we really start to understand the world we live in and our place in it. Right. So, in other words, if you want to understand your life, if you want to actually see things with the lights on, and really beyond that, if you want to live the life of depth and satisfaction that your soul longs for, study God. He is the life behind the life that you're looking for. He's the fountain, the source, and his light gives you light. Okay, so that's kind of the why. That's kind of that's what's motivating this. It's not just here's some interesting academic distinctions. Here's some old dead theologians. Look at how cool these guys are. Right. The point of this is that you would seek God, see God, and be satisfied in God. So for this lesson, really, I have two main goals. First, I want to just survey really just a bunch of historical theologians. Right. It's entirely possible that you've only heard of this doctrine probably a few weeks ago when I started the series, or maybe a few months before that, or sometime recently. But what I want you to see is that this doctrine is both ancient and universal. Right, on my list here, you're going to see Lutherans, you're going to see Reformed theologians, right? I have some medievals, I have some patristics, right? I have Latins and Greeks, right? This doctrine goes all the way back, right? As long as Christians have been thinking about God, they have recognized that the God of the Bible is simple, radically simple. So I just want you to see that continuity a little bit, to see that within this community, within the church that you're standing in, we have confessed and been looking to this simple God. So then, so I want to see kind of the historical angle, but then second, I want to kind of close out with a little bit of a more kind of focused textual reflection, right? I want to just point you to two key passages that kind of undergird and underline the doctrine of divine simplicity. So I want to do a little bit of historical work and then do a little bit of textual work. So with that in mind, let's jump into some of the quotes from these historic theologians. So first, I want to look at John Owen, because I want to give some more kind of extended quotation and try to explain it a little bit, engage a little bit more with John and kind of the argument he's making here. So some of the others, really all the others, I'm just going to kind of read some comments from them with really little or no comment, just kind of let them speak for themselves, especially as we start to see things kind of piling up a little bit. Meaning you'll start to see some kind of recurring themes, recurring comments, recurring topics, and so I don't really need to comment on that every time we see it. But first, I want to start kind of with a little bit more of a substantive engagement. So John Owen, he's someone who lived from 1616 when he was born to 1683, right? So he lived to 67, and he was an English nonconformist, basically meaning that he was a dissenting Puritan, right? So the Puritans were a group of pastors, basically, who insisted on purifying, that's why they get their name, the Church of England, right? Basically, they insisted that the Reformation in England, it was good, but it didn't go far enough, right? The Anglican Church, to their view, retained too much of the kind of superstition and clericalism of Rome. So the first type of Puritans basically were those who insisted on staying within the Church of England, right? Who said this needs to be purified and reformed, but we're not going anywhere. This is our church. We're going to stay here. And so they were advocating for reform from within, right? And then the second type of Puritans were those who left the Church of England and sought to basically establish more biblical churches apart from the established church. And so some of those left the church willingly and said, on conscience, I can't pastor within this structure. So we need to go start a more biblical church outside the Church of England. And some people would have liked to have stayed within the church, but they just couldn't, under their conscience, under the word of God, they just couldn't abide by the things they're being told to do. So they got the boot. They got kicked out themselves. So it's kind of those two kinds. So Owen himself was a Congregationalist, so that second kind, who was himself outside the Church of England. So a Congregationalist is basically a Baptist in every way, except for the question of infant baptism. So they're a Baptist that baptizes their babies, basically. So the Puritan movement, kind of broadly speaking, can basically be told kind of by its three brightest lights, right? So the first great Puritan, kind of often called the father of English Puritanism, was a guy named William Perkins, right? He himself was a committed Anglican, but a staunch advocate for reform from within. And so then we get John Owen. In a lot of ways, he was kind of the high watermark of Puritanism. And again, a Congregationalist himself, so from outside the Church of England. And then kind of the evening star of Puritanism on the back end was Jonathan Edwards, who was an American colonist and kind of, shepherd of the first Great Awakening in the colonies. So, William Perkins, this is interesting. It's kind of just some interesting historical background. William Perkins, he died about 15 years before Owen was born. And then Edwards was born about 20 years after Owen died, right? So you kind of think of the lifetime of William Perkins, a little bit of a gap, lifetime of John Owen, a little bit of a gap, and lifetime of Jonathan Edwards. That was kind of the couple hundred years era of Puritanism in the English-speaking world. There's a similar Dutch thing going on, basically called the Further Reformation, in some Dutch phrase I can't do. Some similar going on around the same time period, similar ideas, a lot of cross-pollination there. But that's kind of the story from the English side. So, interestingly, Owen, his most kind of extended discussion on divine simplicity, at least that I'm aware of, that I was able to find, comes from actually just an introduction to one of his books on the gospel and justification. His book is titled Vindicie Evangelicae, or kind of in English, A Vindication of the Gospel. So interestingly, in that kind of time period, they would do these books, and then they would basically put, sometimes they would have these introductions that were almost like small books in their own right that were on kind of a similar topic, but just kind of oh, hey, here's, this extended essay on something else that's tangentially connected, and here you go, one book. Interesting little thing. I guess they didn't have blogs back then, so I had to get those little things out there somehow, or podcasts, I suppose. So in this introduction, he's basically what he's trying to do is basically refuting this catechism that was put out by a guy named Mr. Biddle, who this Biddle guy, who keeps calling Mr. B, was a Socinian. So Socinians were this kind of post-Reformation, early modern group of heretics, and that's a strong word, but very much so. This was a heretical offshoot of Christianity, the Socinians, who basically they magnified human reason to the exclusion of all doctrine that they found offensive to reason, right? So famously, kind of their claim to fame is that they denied the doctrine of the Trinity. They looked at it and said, "Nah, that doesn't make any sense. I don't believe it." Right? It's your classic, like, I don't get it, therefore I don't like it, therefore it's not true. Not exactly a watertight argument, but we've all been there. So that's oversimplifying it, but here we are. So that's probably the main kind of tenet of Socinianism. The main kind of claim to fame of Socinianism is their anti-Trinitarianism. But really, it goes down the waterfront. There are lots of other doctrines that they denied. They hated penal substitutionary atonement. They thought that the idea that God would substitute His Son for our redemption was just ridiculous, right? Surely we need to, merit our own redemption. Jesus is just a really good example to them, right? If you're paying attention to church history, we've heard that before, and we hear it today too. So, kind of on the same line of reasoning, they rejected this doctrine. They rejected the doctrine of divine simplicity. They didn't get it. They didn't like it. Can't be true. So they found it offensive to reason, right? If God is to be known by us, they reasoned, He must be kind of composed of limited and discrete parts that we can kind of wrap our minds around, just like us, right? So, one thing that I just want to note on that Evenus description, right, is there is a good bit of opposition to the doctrine of divine simplicity, right? I kind of mentioned that, I can't remember which one it was in. I mentioned that where that with the Trinity, it's confusing, it's difficult. But at least within Christian circles, there's broad-based consensus that this is true. We need to kind of wrangle over what exactly it means, but this is true. The problem with divine simplicity is that even in our day, like good, godly, Bible-believing Christians disagree over whether or not simplicity is even true. So there's some controversy there. Um, right. So those, even among those who are genuinely trying to affirm historic biblical Christianity, right? But being, transparent, I worry that they don't seem to realize basically the kind of historical company that they're keeping, right? When you start to make the same arguments as a Socinian, that is a bad spot to be. That is not a good spot to be. So before John Owen really tackles simplicity head on, he makes this comment that I just wanted to share. It's really helpful for a couple of reasons. So he references Exodus 3 verse 15 that we'll get to later on at the end here. So Owen says, God says of himself that his name is Ehyeh, and he is I am. That is a simple being existing in and of himself. End quote. That was a Hebrew word for the word that God calls himself there. I wasn't clearing my throat, but anyways, you probably figured that out. So Exodus doesn't like come forward and teach, hey, here's the doctrine of simplicity, right? It's not right on the surface, but it makes simplicity unavoidable, right? It gets you to the point where once you ask the question, you have to come down on the side of simplicity, right? Exodus 3:15 teaches that God is eternally self-existent. And that is kind of the main thrust of the doctrine of simplicity. God doesn't exist in or on or from anything else. He exists in himself alone. I am. Right? If he were, composed of metaphysical or conceptual parts, then he would be existing in something prior to himself. So then Owen basically just gets to work kind of explaining the divine simplicity, saying, here's what it means, here's where it comes from. So starting that off, he says, first, that simplicity is a property of God's essence or being, is manifest from his absolute independence and firstness in being and operation, which God often insists upon in the revelation of himself. Isaiah 44:6 says, I am the first and I am the last, and besides me there is no God. End quote. Okay, so this basically gets at what I've been trying to say kind of throughout this series. The doctrine of simplicity is a necessary implication of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. This is what he's saying. First, that simplicity is a property of God's essence or being, is manifest. We know that simplicity is true from the fact of God's absolute independence and his absolute firstness, right? So because God is independent and first, we know that simplicity follows from that. And then you see that Isaiah quote where he says, I'm the first, I'm the last. Right. So this is what he's trying to say. To use Owen's word, for God to be absolutely independent and first, that means that he can't be made up of anything more basic than himself. So simplicity flows out of creation out of nothing. Owen explains it by saying, if God were of any causes, or created by any causes, if God were of any causes, internal or external, any principles antecedent or superior to him, he could not be so absolutely first and independent. Or in other words, if God had causes, whether in himself or external to himself, he couldn't be this first and independent being. Right. So basically, there are a few different ways of thinking about causes. Right. There's external causes. Right. You can think of dominoes knocking one another over. That's kind of external causes. But then there are what Owen here calls internal causes. And this is basically kind of causes of composition, right? If God is caused by the kind of various metaphysical and conceptual parts that compose him, he wouldn't really be independent and first, right? But he would be dependent on these things that came before him, right? That's what antecedent means, just things that come before. Right. In other words, if God is composed, if God is made of parts, then God is caused. Right. Again, think creation ex nihilo. So Owen says, were he composed of parts, he could not be first. For all these parts are before that which is composed of them. End quote. Right. So to be first and independent, or to be the absolute creator of everything that is not God, then God must not be made of any kind of parts. So Owen makes a few other points on simplicity, what it is, where it comes from, but just one other that I want to point you to. It kind of is his third point. He says the attributes of God, which alone seem to be distinct things in the essence of God, are all of them essentially the same with one another, and every one the same with the essence of God itself. Let me read that one more time. The attributes of God, which alone seem to be distinct things in the essence of God, are all of them essentially the same with one another, and every one the same with the essence of God himself. End quote. So again, we think of and perceive in God, this difference between his love over here and his justice over here, his knowledge and his power, his goodness and his omnipresence, and all the rest. These are kind of really distinct in our categories and concepts for God and how he acts. But in reality, they are all the same in God and with God's nature. Meaning, God's love is just God's godness, and God's justice is just God's godness, and God's knowledge is just God's godsness, and God's omnipresence is just God's godness. Or again, to use the phrase that James Dolezal made popular recently, all that is in God, all of his attributes, is God. God's love is God. God's justice is God. God's will is God. We perceive these attributes as being kind of after God, posterior to God, but they aren't really prior and constitutive in God like our attributes are in us, right? We are made up of these things, but God isn't. God is just God. Again, I've said this before here, but this implication of simplicity, all of God's attributes are just God himself, really helps us practically, to remember that all of God's acts are all of God acting. He never acts in love without his justice. He never acts in justice without his mercy. He never acts in goodness without his wisdom. All of God's activities, all of God's acts are all of God acting. Okay, so basically just to summarize, kind of two things I want you to see from Owen, right? First, he roots simplicity in God's independence and absolute firstness, right? This meshes with what I've been trying to say about God's simplicity being this necessary implication of creation ex nihilo, right? If you deny simplicity, you deny creation ex nihilo, because if God is composed of parts, obviously those parts have to exist before God does, right? If not like temporally, if not in time succession, at least logically, they at least have to be kind of logically prior to God. If God is composed of parts that are not themselves just God, then there are things other than God that God did not create. There goes creation ex nihilo, right? Okay, so then second, that's kind of the first summary from Owen. The second, Owen observes that simplicity shapes how we should think about God's attributes, right? Again, just all of God is God. All of God's acts are all of God acting. Okay, so this is where I'm going to go ahead and stop for this first bite out of this last installment. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop here. We'll pick back up where we leave off in our next one. It should come out tomorrow. And again, so we looked at Owen, but that's just going to kind of be more historical survey, but at kind of a higher level. It'll just be, here's this guy, here's whatever his time period, here's what he said. Quick comment. All right, next guy. Here's what he said. Quick comment. All right, so it'll be a little bit more. It'll clip a little bit more. But so we'll stop here for today. Then we'll come back with some more historical voices on divine simplicity next time. All right, that's all for now.